Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapters Live. As always, I'm Caitlin from the Fletcher branch. As always, I have on my fabulous hat. And we are down to our last two readings for Jules Verne's epic novel, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, last time we read, let's catch up. We were in the Red Sea. We were able to cross through Captain Nemo's Arabian Tunnel from the seemingly dead end of the Red Sea into the Mediterranean Sea. Once we got over to the Mediterranean Sea, Ned Land, ever in search of his freedom, immediately decided to prompt an escape attempt. And unfortunately, even though Professor Aronnax was on board and ready to go, despite his reluctance to leave the Nautilus, the very night that they were going to escape was when Captain Nemo decided to park in the Bay of Vigo, which was actually a site of a large shipwreck. And this is one of the areas where he gathers treasure so that he has a constant supply of treasure. And it was also during that time where Aronnax figured out that despite all of his claims to despise humanity, Nemo kind of has a soft side for the downtrodden and the oppressed and the beaten down peoples of the world. So he's not entirely removed from terrestrial feelings. And when we had last left off, we had just seen Captain Nemo go after a group of sperm whales to protect a group of baleen whales. And he basically slaughtered the entire herd of sperm whales. And it was kind of for the first time that everybody, including Ned Land and Aronnax, saw Nemo's savagery and what he's like sort of truly capable of. And I think a little bit kind of put a little bit of a bad taste in everybody's mouth, including Ned Land's especially. And we are going to pick back up with Chapter 10, A Lost Continent. The next morning, February 19th, I beheld the Canadian entering my stateroom. I was expecting this visit. He wore an expression of great disappointment. "Well, sir," he said to me. "Well, Ned, the fates were against us yesterday. Yes, that damned captain had to call a halt just as we were going to escape from his boat. Yes, Ned, he had business with his bankers. His bankers? Or rather his bank vaults, by which I mean this ocean, where his wealth is safer than in any national treasury." I then related the evening's incidents to the Canadian, secretly hoping he would come around to the idea of not deserting the captain. But my narrative had no result other than Ned's voicing deep regret that he hadn't strolled across the Vigo battlefield on his own behalf. "Anyhow," he said, "it's not over yet. My first harpoon miss, that's all. We'll succeed the next time, and as soon as this evening, if need be." "What's the Nautilus's heading?" I asked. "I've no idea," Ned replied. "All right, at noon we'll find out what our position is." The Canadian returned to Conseil's side. As soon as I was dressed, I went into the lounge. The compass wasn't encouraging. The Nautilus's course was south-southwest. We were turning our backs on Europe. I could hardly wait until our position was reported on the chart. Near 11:30, the ballast tanks emptied and the submersible rose to the surface of the ocean. I leaped onto the platform. Ned Land was already there. No more shore in sight. Nothing but the immenseness of the sea. A few sails were on the horizon, no doubt ships going as far as Cape Sal Roque to find favorable winds for doubling the Cape of Good Hope. The sky was overcast. A squall was on the way. Furious, Ned tried to see through the mists on the horizon. He still hoped that behind all that fog there lay the shores he longed for. At noon, the sun made a momentary appearance. Taking advantage of this rift in the clouds, the chief officer took the orb's altitude. Then the sea grew turbulent, we went below again, and the hatch closed once more. When I consulted the chart an hour later, I saw the Nautilus's position was marked at longitude 16 degrees 17 and latitude 33 degrees 22, a good 150 leagues from the nearest coast. It wouldn't even dream of escaping, and I'll let the reader decide how promptly the Canadian threw a tantrum when I ventured to tell him our situation. As for me, I wasn't exactly grief-stricken. It felt as if a heavy weight had been lifted from me, and I was able to resume my regular tasks in a state of comparative calm. Near 11 o'clock in the evening, I received a most unexpected visit from Captain Nemo. He asked me very graciously if I felt exhausted from our vigil the night before. I said no. Then, Professor Aronnax, I propose an unusual excursion. "Propose away, Captain. So far you've visited the ocean depth only by day and under sunlight. Would you like to see these depths on a dark night?" Very much. I warn you, this will be an exhausting stroll. We'll need to walk up long hours and scale a mountain. The roads aren't terribly well kept up. Everything you say, Captain, just increases my curiosity. I'm ready to go with you. Then come along, Professor, and we'll go put on our diving suits. Arriving at the wardrobe, I saw that neither my companions nor any crewmen would be coming with us on this excursion. Captain Nemo hadn't even suggested my fetching Ned or Conseil. In a few moments we had put on our equipment. Air tanks, abundantly charged, were placed on our backs, but the electric lamps were not in readiness. I commented on this to the captain. "They'll be useless to us," he replied. I thought I hadn't heard him right, but I couldn't repeat my comment because the captain's head had already disappeared into its metal covering. I finished harnessing myself. I felt an alpenstock being placed in my hand, and a few minutes later, after the usual procedures, we set foot on the floor of the Atlantic, 300 meters down. Midnight was approaching. The waters were profoundly dark, but Captain Nemo pointed to a reddish spot in the distance, a sort of wide glow shimmering about 2 miles from the Nautilus. What this fire was, what substances fed it, how and why it kept burning in the liquid mass, I couldn't say. Anyhow, it lit our way, although hazily, but I soon grew accustomed to this unique gloom, and in these circumstances I understood the uselessness of the Ruhmkorff device. Side by side, Captain Nemo and I dived directly toward this conspicuous flame. The level seafloor rose imperceptibly. We took long strides, helped by our alpenstocks, but in general our progress was slow because our feet kept sinking into a kind of slimy mud mixed with seaweed and assorted flat stones. As we moved forward, I heard a kind of pitter-patter above my head. Sometimes this noise increased and became a continuous crackle. I soon realized the cause. It was a heavy rainfall rattling on the surface of the waves. Instinctively, I worried that I might get soaked. By water! In the midst of water! I couldn't help but sit smiling at this outlandish notion. But to tell you the truth, wearing these heavy diving suits, you no longer feel the liquid element. You simply think you're in the midst of air a little denser than air on land, that's all. After half an hour of walking, the seafloor grew rocky. Jellyfish, microscopic crustaceans, and sea-pen coral lit it faintly with their phosphorescent glimmers. I glimpsed piles of stones covered by a couple million zoophytes and tangles of algae. My feet often slipped on this viscous seaweed carpet, and without my alpenstock I would have fallen more than once. When I turned around, I could still see the Nautilus's whitish beacon, which was starting to grow pale in the distance. Those piles of stones just mentioned were laid out on the ocean floor with a distinct but inexplicable symmetry. I spotted giant furrows trailing off into the distant darkness, their length incalculable. There were also other peculiarities I couldn't make sense of. It seemed to me that my heavy lead soles were crushing a litter of bones that made a dry, crackling noise. So what were these vast plains we were now crossing? I wanted to ask the captain, but I still didn't grasp that sign language that allowed him to chat with his companions when they went with him on his underwater excursions. Meanwhile, the reddish light guiding us had expanded and inflamed the horizon. The presence of this furnace under the waters had me extremely puzzled. Was it some sort of electrical discharge? Was I approaching some natural phenomenon still unknown to scientists on shore? Or, rather, and this thought did cross my mind, had the hand of man intervened in that blaze? Had human beings fanned those flames? In these deep strata, would I meet up with more of Captain Nemo's companions, friends he was about to visit who led lives as strange as his own? Would I find a whole colony of exiles down here, men tired of the world's woes, men who had sought and found independence in the ocean's lower depths? All these insane, inadmissible ideas dogged me, and in this frame of mind, continually excited by the series of wonders passing before my eyes, I wouldn't have been surprised to find on the sea bottom one of those underwater towns Captain Nemo dreamed about. Our path was getting brighter and brighter. The red glow had turned white and was radiating from a mountain peak about 800 feet high. But what I saw was simply a reflection produced by the crystal waters of these strata. The furnace that was the source of this inexplicable light occupied the far side of the mountain. In the midst of the stone mazes furrowing this Atlantic seafloor, Captain Nemo moved forward without hesitation. He knew this dark path. No doubt he had often traveled it and was incapable of losing his way. I followed him with unshakable confidence. He seemed like some spirit of the sea, and as he walked ahead of me, I marveled at his tall figure, which stood out in black against the glowing background of the horizon. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. We arrived at the mountain's lower gradients, but in grappling with them, we had to venture up difficult trails through a huge thicket. Yes, a thicket of dead trees. Trees without leaves, without sap, turned to stone by the action of the waters, and crowned here and there by gigantic pines. It was like a still erect coal field, its roots clutching broken soil, its boughs clearly outlined against the ceiling of the waters like thin black paper cutouts. Picture a forest clinging to the sides of a peak in the Harz Mountains, but a submerged forest. The trails were cluttered with algae and fucus plants, hosts of crustaceans swarming among them. I plunged on, scaling rocks, straddling fallen tree trunks, snapping marine creepers that swayed from one tree to another, startling the fish that flitted from branch to branch. Carried away, I didn't feel exhausted anymore. I followed a guide who was immune to exhaustion. What a sight! How can I describe it? How can I portray these woods and rocks in this liquid setting, their lower parts dark and sullen, their upper parts tinted red in this light whose intensity was doubled by the reflecting power of the waters? We scaled rocks that crumbled behind us, collapsing in enormous sections with the hollow rumble of an avalanche. To our right and left there were carved gloomy galleries where the eye lost its way. Huge glades opened up, seemingly cleared by the hand of man, and I sometimes wondered whether some residents of these underwater regions would suddenly appear before me. But Captain Nemo kept climbing. I didn't want to fall behind. I followed him boldly. My alpenstock was a great help. One wrong step would have been disastrous on the narrow paths cut into the sides of these chasms, but I walked along with a firm tread and without the slightest feeling of dizziness. Sometimes I leaped over a crevasse whose depth would have made me recoil had I been in the midst of glaciers on shore. Sometimes I ventured out onto a wobbling tree trunk fallen across a gorge, without looking down, having eyes only for marveling at the wild scenery of this region. There, leaning on erratically cut foundations, monumental rocks seemed to defy the laws of balance. From between their stony knees, trees sprung up like jets under fearsome pressure, supporting other trees that supported them in turn. Next, natural towers with wide, steeply carved battlements leaned at angles that, on dry land, the laws of gravity never would have authorized. And I too could feel the difference created by the water's powerful density. Despite my heavy clothing, copper headpiece, and metal soles, I climbed the most impossibly steep gradients with all the nimbleness, I swear it, of a chamois or a Pyrenees mountain goat. As for my account of this excursion under the waters, I'm well aware that it sounds incredible. I'm the chronicler of deeds seemingly impossible and yet incontestably real. This was no fantasy. This was what I saw and felt. 2 hours after leaving the Nautilus, we had cleared the timberline, and 100 feet above our heads stood the mountain peak, forming a dark silhouette against the brilliant glare that came from its far slope. Petrified shrubs rambled here and there in sprawling zigzags. Fish rose in a body at our feet like birds startled in tall grass. The rocky mass was gouged with impenetrable crevices, deep caves, unfathomable holes at whose far ends I could hear fearsome things moving about. My blood would curdle as I watched some enormous antenna bar my path. I saw some frightful pincher snap shut in the shadow of some cavity. 1,000 specks of light glittered in the midst of the gloom. They were the eyes of gigantic crustaceans crouching in their layers, giant lobsters rearing up like spear carriers and moving their claws with a scrap iron clanking, titanic crabs aiming their bodies like cannons on their carriages, and hideous devilfish intertwining their tentacles like bushes of writhing snakes. What was this astounding world that I didn't yet know? In what order did these articulates belong, these creatures for whom the rocks provided a second carapace? Where had nature learned the secret of their vegetating existence, and for how many centuries had they lived in the ocean's lower strata? But I couldn't linger. Captain Nemo, on familiar terms with these dreadful animals, no longer minded them. We arrived at a preliminary plateau where still other surprises were waiting for me. These picturesque ruins took shape, betraying the hand of man, not our creator. They were huge stacks of stones in which you could distinguish the indistinct forms of palaces and temples, now arrayed in hosts of blossoming zoophytes, and over it all, not ivy, but a heavy mantle of algae and fucus plants. But what part of the globe could this be, this land swallowed by cataclysms? Who had set up these rocks and stones like the dolmens of prehistoric times? Where was I? Where had Captain Nemo's fancies taken me? I wanted to ask him. Unable to, I stopped him. I seized his arm, but he shook his head, pointed to the mountain's topmost peak, and seemed to tell me, "Come on, come with me, come higher." I followed him with one last burst of energy, and in a few minutes I had scaled the peak, which crowned the whole rocky mass by some 10 meters. I looked back down the side we had just cleared. There the mountain rose only 700 to 800 feet above the plains, but on its far slope it crowned the receding bottom of this part of the Atlantic by a height twice that. My eyes scanned the distance and took in a vast area lit by intense flashes of light. In essence, this mountain was a volcano. 50 feet below its peak, amid a shower of stones and slag, a wide crater vomited torrents of lava that were dispersed in fiery cascades into the heart of the liquid mass. So situated, this volcano was an immense torch that lit up the lower plains all the way to the horizon. As I said, this underwater crater spewed lava, but not flames. Flames need oxygen from the air and are unable to spread underwater, but a lava flow, which contains in itself the principle of its incandescence, can rise to a white heat, overpower the liquid element, and turn it into steam on contact. Swift currents swept away all this diffuse gas, and torrents of lava slid to the foot of the mountain, like the disgorgings of a Mount Vesuvius over the city limits of a second Torre del Greco. In fact, there beneath my eyes was a town in ruins, demolished, overwhelmed, laid low, its roofs caved in, its temples pulled down, its arches dislocated, its columns stretching over the earth. In these ruins, you could still detect the solid proportions of a sort of Tuscan architecture. Further off, the remains of a giant aqueduct. Here, the caked heights of an acropolis along with the fluid forms of a Parthenon. There, the remnants of a wharf, as if some bygone port had long ago harbored merchant vessels and triple-tiered war galleys on the shores of some lost ocean. Still further off, long rows of collapsing walls, deserted thoroughfares, a whole Pompeii buried under the waters, which Captain Nemo had resurrected before my eyes. Where was I? Where was I? I had to find out at all costs. I wanted to speak. I wanted to rip off the copper spear imprisoning my head. But Captain Nemo came over, stopped me with a gesture. Then, picking up a piece of chalky stone, he advanced to a black basaltic rock and scrawled this one word: Atlantis. What lightning flashed through my mind! Atlantis, that ancient city of Meropis mentioned by the historian Theopompus, Plato's Atlantis, the continent whose very existence has been denied by such philosophers and scientists as Origen, Porphyry, Amblichus, D'Anville, Maltbrun, and Humboldt, who entered its disappearance in the ledgers of myths and folk tales, the country whose reality has nevertheless been accepted by other such thinkers as Posidonius, Pliny, Ammianus Marcellinus, Tertullian, Engel, Schur, Turnford, Buffon, and D'Avezac. I had this land right under my eyes, furnishing its own impeachable evidence of the catastrophe that had overtaken it. So this was the submerged region that had existed outside Europe, Asia, and Libya, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, home to those powerful Atlantean people against whom ancient Greece had waged its earliest wars. The writer whose narratives record the lofty deeds of those heroic times is Plato himself. His dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, were drafted with the poet and legislator Solon as their inspiration, as it were. One day Solon was conversing with some elderly wise men in the Egyptian capital of Sais, a town already 8,000 years of age, as documented by the annals engraved on the sacred walls of its temples. One of these elders related the history of another town, 1,000 years older still. This original city of Athens, 90 centuries old, had been invaded and partially destroyed by the Atlanteans. These Atlanteans, he said, resided on an immense continent, greater than Africa and Asia combined, taking in an area that lay between latitude 12 degrees and 40 degrees north. Their dominion extended even to Egypt. They tried to enforce their rule as far as Greece, but they had to retreat before the indomitable resistance of the Hellenic people. Centuries passed. A cataclysm occurred, floods, earthquakes. A single night and day were enough to obliterate this Atlantis, whose highest peaks, Madeira, the Azores, the Canaries, the Cape Verde Islands still emerge above the waves. These were the historic memories that Captain Nemo's scrawl sent rushing through my mind. Thus, by the strangest of fates, I was treading underfoot one of the mountains of that continent. My hands were touching ruins many thousands of years old, contemporary with prehistoric times. I was walking in the very place where contemporaries of early man had walked. My heavy soles were crushing the skeletons of animals from the age of fable, animals that used to take cover in the shade of these trees now turned to stone. Oh, why was I so short of time? I would have gone down the steep slopes of this mountain, crossed this entire immense continent, which surely connects Africa with America, and visited its great prehistoric cities. Under my eyes there perhaps lay the warlike town of Makimos, or the pious village of Eusebes, whose gigantic inhabitants lived for whole centuries, and had the strength to raise blocks of stone that still withstood the action of the waves. One day, perhaps, some volcanic phenomenon will bring these sunken ruins back to the surface of the waves. Numerous underwater volcanoes have been sighted in this part of the ocean, and many ships have felt terrific tremors when passing over these turbulent depths. A few have heard hollow noises that announce some struggle of the elements far below. Others have hauled in volcanic ash hurled above the waves. As far as the equator, this whole seafloor is still under construction by plutonic forces, and in some remote epoch, built up by volcanic gorgings and successive layers of lava. Who knows whether the peaks of these fire-belching mountains may reappear above the surface of the Atlantic? As I mused in this way, trying to establish in my memory every detail of this impressive landscape, Captain Nemo was leaning his elbows on a moss-covered monument, motionless as if petrified in some mute trance. Was he dreaming of those lost generations, asking them for the secret of human destiny? Was it here that this strange man came to revive himself, basking in historical memories, reliving that bygone life, he who had no desire for a modern one, would have given anything to know his thoughts, to share them, understand them? We stayed in this place an entire hour, contemplating its vast plains and the lava's glow, which sometimes took on a startling intensity. Inner boiling sent quick shivers running through the mountain's crust. Noises from deep underneath, clearly transmitted by the liquid medium, reverberated with majestic amplitude. Just then the moon appeared for an instant through the watery mass, casting a few pale rays over this submerged continent. It was only a fleeting glimmer, but its effect was indescribable. The captain stood up and took one last look at these immense plains, then his hand signaled me to follow him. We went swiftly down the mountain. Once past the petrified forest, I could see the Nautilus's beacon twinkling like a star. The captain walked straight toward it, and we were back on board just as a few glimmers of dawn were whitening the surface of the ocean. Chapter 11. The Underwater Coalfields. The next day, February 20th, I overslept. I was so exhausted from the night before I didn't get up until 11 o'clock. I dressed quickly. I hurried to find the Nautilus's heading. The instruments indicated that it was running southward at a speed of 20 miles per hour and a depth of 100 meters. Conseil entered. I described our nocturnal excursion to him, and since the panels were open, he could still catch a glimpse of this submerged continent. In fact, the Nautilus was skimming only 10 meters over the soil of these Atlantis plains. The ship scudded along like an air balloon borne by the wind over some prairie on land, but it would be more accurate to say that we sat in the lounge as if we were riding in a coach on an express train. As for the foregrounds passing before our eyes, they were fantastically carved rocks, forests of trees that had crossed over from the vegetable kingdom into the mineral kingdom, their motionless silhouettes sprawling beneath the waves. There were also stony masses buried beneath carpets of Axidia and sea anemone, bristling with long vertical water plants, then strangely contoured blocks of lava that testified to all the fury of these plutonic developments. While this bizarre scenery was glittering under our electric beams, I told Conseil the story of the Atlanteans, who had inspired the old French scientist Jean Belay to write so many entertaining, albeit utterly fictitious, pages. I told the lad about the wars of these heroic people. I discussed the question of Atlantis with the fervor of a man who no longer had any doubts. But Conseil was so distracted he barely heard me, and his lack of interest in any commentary on this historical topic was soon explained. In essence, numerous fish had caught his eye, and, When fish pass by, Conseil vanishes into his world of classifying and leaves real life behind, in which case I could only tag along and resume our ichthyological research. Even so, these Atlantic fish were not noticeably different from those we had observed earlier. There were rays of gigantic size, 5 meters long, and with muscles so powerful they could leap above the waves. Sharks of various species, including a 15-foot glaucous shark with sharp triangular teeth, and so transparent it was almost invisible amid the waters. Brown lantern sharks, prism-shaped humatin sharks armored with protuberant hides, sturgeons resembling their relatives in the Mediterranean, trumpet-snouted pipefish 1.5 feet long, yellowish-brown with small gray fins and no teeth or tongue, unreeling like slim, supple snakes. Among bony fish, Conseil noted some blackish marlin 3 meters long with a sharp sword jutting from the upper jaw, bright colored weavers known in Aristotle's day as sea dragons, and whose dorsal stingers make them quite dangerous to pick up. Then dolphin fish with brown backs striped in blue and edged in gold, handsome dorados, moon-like opas that look like azure discs, but when the sun's rays turn to spots of silver. Finally, 8-meter swordfish from the genus Ziphius, swimming in schools, sporting yellow sickle-shaped fins and 6-foot broadswords, stalwart animals, plant eaters rather than fish eaters, obeying the tiniest signals from their females like hen-pecked husbands. But while observing these different species of marine fauna, I didn't stop examining the long plains of Atlantis. Sometimes an unpredictable irregularity in the seafloor would force the Nautilus to slow down, and then it would glide into the narrow channels between the hills with a cetacean's dexterity. If the labyrinth became hopelessly tangled, the submersible would rise above it like an airship, and after clearing the obstacle, it would resume its speedy course just a few meters above the ocean floor. It was an enjoyable and impressive way of navigating that did indeed recall the maneuvers of an airship ride, with the major difference that the Nautilus faithfully obeyed the hands of its helmsman. The terrain consisted mostly of thick slime mixed with petrified branches, but it changed little by little near 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It grew rockier and seemed to be strewn with pudding stones and a basaltic gravel called tuff, together with bits of lava and sulfurous obsidian. I expected these long plains to change into mountain regions. And in fact, as the Nautilus was executing certain turns, I noticed that the southerly horizon was blocked by a high wall that seemed to close off every exit. Its summit obviously poked above the level of the ocean. It had to be a continent, or at least an island, either one of the Canaries or one of the Cape Verde Islands. Our bearings hadn't been marked on the chart, perhaps deliberately, and I had no idea what our position was. In any case, this wall seemed to signal the end of Atlantis, of which, all in all, we had crossed only a small part. Nightfall didn't interrupt my observations. I was left to myself. Conseil had repaired to his cabin. The Nautilus slowed down, hovering above the muddled masses on the seafloor, sometimes grazing them as if wanting to come to rest, sometimes rising unpredictably to the surface of the waves. Then I glimpsed a few bright constellations through the crystal waters, specifically 5 or 6 of those zodiacal stars trailing from the tail end of Orion. I would have stayed longer at my window, marveling at these beauties of sea and sky, but the panels closed. Just then the Nautilus had arrived at the perpendicular face of that high wall. How the ship would maneuver, I hadn't to guess. I repaired to my stateroom. The Nautilus did not stir. I fell asleep with the firm intention of waking up in just a few hours, but it was 8 o'clock the next day when I returned to the lounge. I stared at the pressure gauge. It told me that the Nautilus was afloat on the surface of the ocean. Furthermore, I heard the sound of footsteps on the platform, yet there were no rolling movements to indicate the presence of waves undulating above me. I climbed as far as the hatch. It was open, but instead of the broad daylight I was expecting, I found that I was surrounded by total darkness. Where were we? Had I been mistaken? Was it still night? No, not one star was twinkling, and nighttime is never so utterly black. I wasn't sure what to think when a voice said to me, "Is that you, Professor?" "Ah, Captain Nemo," I replied. "Where are we?" "Underground, Professor." "Underground?" I exclaimed. "And the Nautilus is still floating?" "It always floats." But I don't understand." "Wait a little while. Our beacon is about to go on, and if you want some light on the subject, you'll be satisfied." I set foot on the platform and waited. The darkness was so profound I couldn't even see Captain Nemo. However, looking at the zenith directly overhead, I thought I caught sight of a feeble glimmer, a sort of twilight filtering through a circular hole. Just then the beacon suddenly went on, and its intense brightness made that hazy light vanish. This stream of electricity dazzled my eyes, and after momentarily shutting them, I looked around. The Nautilus was stationary. It was floating next to an embankment shaped like a wharf. As for the water now buoying the ship, it was a lake completely encircled by an inner wall about 2 miles in diameter, hence 6 miles around. Its level, as indicated by the pressure gauge, would be the same as the outside level because some connection had to exist between this lake and the sea. Slanting inward over their base, these high walls converged to form a vault shaped like an immense upside-down funnel that measured 500 or 600 meters in height. At its summit, there gaped the circular opening through which I detected that faint glimmer, obviously daylight. Before more carefully examining the interior features of this enormous cavern, and before deciding if it was the work of nature or humankind, I went over to Captain Nemo. "Where are we?" I said. "In the heart of an extinct volcano," the captain answered me, "and in a volcano whose interior was invaded by the sea after some convulsion in the earth. While you were sleeping, Professor, the Nautilus entered this lagoon through a natural channel that opens 10 meters below the surface of the ocean. This is our home port, secure, convenient, secret, and sheltered against winds from any direction. Along the coasts of your continents or islands, show me any offshore mooring that can equal this safe refuge for withstanding the fury of hurricanes." "Indeed," I replied, "here you're in perfect safety, Captain Nemo. Who could reach you in the heart of a volcano?" "But don't I see an opening at its summit?" "Yes, its crater, a crater formerly filled with lava, steam, and flames, but which now lets in this life-giving air we're breathing." "But which volcanic mountain is this?" I asked. It's one of the many islets with which this sea is strewn. For ships, a mere reef; for us, an immense cavern. I discovered it by chance, and chance has served me well." "But couldn't someone enter through the mouth of its crater?" "No more than I could exit through it. You can climb about 100 feet up the inner base of this mountain, but then the walls overhang. They lean too far in to be scaled." "I can see, Captain, that nature is your obedient servant any time or any place. You're safe on this lake, and nobody else can visit its waters. But what's the purpose of this refuge? The Nautilus doesn't need a harbor." "No, Professor, but it needs electricity to run, batteries to generate its electricity, sodium to feed its batteries, coal to make its sodium, and coal fields from which to dig its coal. Now then, right at this spot, the sea covers entire forests that sank underwater in prehistoric times. Today, turned to stone, transformed into carbon fuel, they offer me inexhaustible coal mines." "So, Captain, your men practice the trade of miners here?" "Precisely. These mines extend under the waves like the coal fields at Newcastle. Here, dressed in diving suits, pick and mattock in hand, my men go out and dig this carbon fuel for which I don't need a single mine on land. When I burn this combustible to produce sodium, the smoke escaping from the mountain's crater gives it the appearance of a still active volcano." "And will we see your companions at work?" "No, at least not this time, because I'm eager to continue our underwater tour of the world. Accordingly, I'll rest content with drawing on my reserve stock of sodium. We'll stay here long enough to load it on board, in other words, a single workday. Then we'll resume our voyage. So, Professor Aronnax, if you'd like to explore this cavern and circle its lagoon, seize the day." I thanked the captain and went to look for my 2 companions, who hadn't yet left their cabin. I invited them to follow me, not telling them where we were. They climbed onto the platform. Conseil, whom nothing could startle, saw it as a perfectly natural thing to fall asleep under the waves and wake up under a mountain. But Ned Land had no idea in his head other than to see if this cavern offered some way out. After breakfast near 10 o'clock, we went down onto the embankment. "So, here we are, back on shore," Conseil said. "I'd hardly call this shore," the Canadian replied, "and besides, we aren't on it, but under it." A sandy beach unfolded before us, measuring 500 feet at its widest point between the waters of the lake and the foot of the mountain's walls. Via the strand, you could easily circle the lake. But the base of these high walls consisted of broken soil over which there lay picturesque piles of volcanic blocks and enormous pumice stones. All of these crumbling masses were covered with an enamel polished by the action of underground fires, and they glistened under the stream of electric light from our beacon. Stirred up by our footsteps, The mica-rich dust on this beach flew into the air like a cloud of sparks. The ground rose appreciably as it moved away from the sand flats by the waves, and we soon arrived at some long, winding gradients, genuinely steep paths that allowed us to climb little by little, but we had to tread cautiously in the midst of pudding stones that weren't cemented together, and our feet kept skidding on glassy trachyte made of feldspar and quartz crystals. The volcanic nature of this enormous pit was apparent all around us. I ventured to comment on it to my companions. Can you picture, I asked them, what this funnel must have been like when it was filled with boiling lava, and the level of that incandescent liquid rose right to the mountain's mouth like cast iron up the insides of a furnace? I can picture it perfectly, Conseil replied. But will master tell me why this huge smelter suspended operations? And how is it that an oven was replaced by the tranquil waters of a lake? In all likelihood, Conseil, because some convulsion created an opening below the surface of the ocean, the opening that serves as a passageway for the Nautilus. Then the waters of the Atlantic rushed inside the mountain. There ensued a dreadful struggle between the elements of fire and water, a struggle ending in King Neptune's favor. But many centuries have passed since then, and this submerged volcano has changed into a peaceful cavern. That's fine, Ned Land answered. I accept the explanation, but in our personal interest, I'm sorry this opening the professor mentions wasn't made above sea level. But Ned, my friend, Conseil answered, if it weren't an underwater passageway, the Nautilus couldn't enter it. And I might add, Mr. Land, I said, that the waters wouldn't have rushed under the mountain, and the volcano would still be a volcano, so you have nothing to be sorry about. Our climb continued. The gradients got steeper and narrower. Sometimes they were cut across by deep pits that had to be cleared. Masses of overhanging rock had to be gotten round. You slid on your knees, you crept on your belly. But, helped by the Canadian strength and Conseil's dexterity, we overcame every obstacle. At an elevation of about 30 meters, the nature of the terrain changed without becoming any easier. Pudding stones and trachyte gave way to black basaltic rock. Here, lying in slabs all swollen with blisters, there, shaped like actual prisms and arranged into a series of columns that supported the springings of this immense vault, a wonderful sample of natural architecture. Then, among this basaltic rock, there snaked long, hardened lava flows inlaid with veins of bituminous coal and in places covered by wide carpets of sulfur. The sunlight coming through the crater had grown stronger, shedding a hazy light over all the volcanic waste forever buried in the heart of this extinct mountain. But when he had ascended to an elevation of about 250 feet, we were stopped by insurmountable obstacles. The converging inside walls changed into overhangs, and our climb into a circular stroll. At this topmost level, the vegetable kingdom had begun to challenge the mineral kingdom. Shrubs and even a few trees emerged from crevices in the walls. I recognized some spurges that let their caustic, purgative sap trickle out. There were heliotropes, very remiss at living up to their sun-worshipping reputation, since no sunlight ever reached them. Their clusters of flowers drooped sadly, their colors and scents were faded. Here and there chrysanthemums sprouted timidly at the feet of aloes with long, sad, sickly leaves. But between these lava flows I spotted little violets that still gave off a subtle fragrance, and I confess that I inhaled it with delight. The soul of a flower is its scent, and those splendid water plants, flowers of the sea, have no souls. We'd arrived at the foot of a sturdy clump of dragon trees, which were splitting the rocks with exertions of their muscular roots, when Ned Land exclaimed, "Oh, sir, a hive!" "A hive," I answered with a gesture of utter disbelief. "Yes, a hive," the Canadian repeated, "with bees buzzing around." I went closer and was forced to recognize the obvious. At the mouth of a hole cut into the trunk of a dragon tree, there swarmed thousands of these ingenious insects so common to all the Canary Islands, where their output is especially prized. Naturally enough, the Canadian wanted to lay in a supply of honey, and it would have been ill-mannered of me to say no. He mixed sulfur with some dry leaves, set them on fire with a spark from his tinderbox, and proceeded to smoke the bees out. Little by little, the buzzing died down, and the disemboweled hive yielded several pounds of sweet honey. Ned Land stuffed his haversack with it. "When I've mixed this honey with our breadfruit batter," he told us, "I'll be ready to serve you a delectable piece of cake." "But of course," Conseil put in, "it will be gingerbread." "I'm all for gingerbread," I said, "but let's resume this fascinating stroll." At certain turns in the trail we were going along, the lake appeared in its full expanse. The ship's beacon lit up that whole placid surface, which experienced neither ripples nor undulations. The Nautilus lay perfectly still. On its platform and on the embankment, crewmen were bustling around, black shadows that stood out clearly in the midst of the luminous air. Just then we went around the highest ridge of these rocky foothills that supported the vault. Then I saw that bees weren't the animal kingdom's only representatives inside this volcano. Here and there and in the shadows, birds of prey soared and whirred, flying away from nests perched on tips of rock. There were sparrowhawks with white bellies and screeching kestrels. With all their speed their stilk-like legs could muster, fat, fine bustards scampered over the slopes. I'll let the reader decide whether the Canadian's appetite was aroused by the sight of this tasty game, and whether he regretted having no rifle in his hands. He tried to make stones do the work of bullets, and after several fruitless attempts, he manages to wound one of these magnificent bustards. To say he risked his life 20 times in order to capture this bird is simply the unadulterated truth, but he fared so well the animal went into his sack to join the honeycombs. By then we were forced to go back down to the beach because the ridge had become impossible. Above us, the yawning crater looked like the wide mouth of a well. From where we stood, the sky was pretty easy to see, and I watched clouds race by, disheveled by the west wind, letting tatters of mist trail over the mountain's summit. Proof positive that these clouds kept at a moderate altitude, because this volcano didn't rise more than 1,800 feet above the level of the ocean. Half an hour after the Canadians' latest exploits, we were back on the inner beach. There the local flora was represented by a wide carpet of samphire, a small, umbelliferous plant that keeps quite nicely, which also boasts the name glasswort, saxifrage, and sea fennel. Conseil picked a couple bunches. As for the local fauna, it included thousands of crustaceans of every type: lobsters, hermit crabs, prawns, mysid shrimps, daddy longlegs, rock crabs, and a prodigious number of seashells such as cowries, murex snails, and limpets. In this locality there gaped the mouth of a magnificent cave. My companions and I took great pleasure in stretching out on its fine-grained sand. Fire had polished the sparkling enamel of its inner walls, sprinkled all over with mica-rich dust. Ned Land tapped these walls and tried to probe their thickness. I couldn't help smiling. Our conversation then turned to his everlasting escape plans, and without going too far, I felt I could offer him this hope. Captain Nemo had gone down south only to replenish his sodium supplies, so I hoped he would now hug the coasts of Europe and America, which would allow the Canadian to try again with a greater chance of success. We were stretched out in this delightful cave for an hour. Our conversation, lively at the outset, then languished. A definite drowsiness overcame us. Since I saw no good reason to resist the call of sleep, I fell into a heavy doze. I dreamed, one doesn't choose his dreams, that my life had been reduced to the vegetating existence of a simple mollusk. It seemed to me that this cave made up my double-valved shell. Suddenly, Conseil's voice startled me awake. Get up! Get up! Shouted the fine lad. What is it? I asked in a sitting position. The water's coming up to us. I got back on my feet. Like a torrent, the sea was rushing into our retreat, and since we definitely were not mollusks, we had to clear out. In a few seconds, we were safe on top of the cave. What happened? Conseil asked. Some new phenomenon? Not quite, my friends, I replied. It was the tide, merely the tide, which well-nigh caught us by surprise, just as it did Sir Walter Scott's hero. The ocean outside is rising, and by a perfectly natural law of balance, the level of this lake is also rising. We've gotten off with a mild dunking. Let's go change clothes on the Nautilus. 3/4 of an hour later, we had completed our circular stroll and were back on board. Just then the crewmen finished loading the sodium supplies, and the Nautilus could have departed immediately. But Captain Nemo gave no orders. Would he wait for nightfall and exit through his underwater passageway in secret? Perhaps. Be that as it may, by the next day the Nautilus had left its home port and was navigating well out from any shore, a few meters beneath the waves of the Atlantic. Chapter 12. The Sargasso Sea. The Nautilus didn't change direction. For the time being, then, we had to set aside any hope of returning to European seas. Captain Nemo kept his prow pointing south. Where was he taking us? I was afraid to guess. That day the Nautilus crossed an odd part of the Atlantic Ocean. No one is aware of the existence of that great warm weather current known by name as the Gulf Stream. But after emerging from channels off Florida, it heads towards Spitzbergen. But before entering the Gulf of Mexico, near latitude 44 degrees north, this current divides into two arms. Its chief arm makes for the shores of Ireland and Norway, while the second flexes southward, the level of the Azores. Then it hits the coast of Africa, sweeps in a long oval, and returns to the Caribbean Sea. Now then, this second arm, and more accurately a collar, forms a ring of warm water around a section of cool, tranquil, motionless ocean called the Sargasso Sea. This is an actual lake in the open Atlantic, and the great current's waters take at least 3 years to circle it. Properly speaking, the Sargasso Sea covers every submerged part of Atlantis. Certain authors have even held that the many weeds strewn over this sea were torn loose from the prairies of that ancient continent. But it's more likely that these grasses, algae, and fucus plants were carried off from the beaches of Europe and America than taken as far as this zone by the Gulf Stream. This is one of the reasons why Christopher Columbus assumed the existence of a new world. When the ships of that bold investigator arrived in the Sargasso Sea, they had great difficulty navigating in the midst of these weeds, which, much to their crew's dismay, slowed them down to a halt, and they wasted 3 long weeks crossing this sector. Such was the reason our Nautilus was visiting just then. A genuine prairie, a tightly woven carpet of algae, gulfweed, and bladderwrack so dense and compact, a craft stem post couldn't tear through it without difficulty. Accordingly, not wanting to entangle his propeller in this weed-choked mass, Captain Nemo stayed at a depth some meters below the surface of the waves. The name Sargasso comes from the Spanish word sargazo, meaning gulfweed. This gulfweed, the swimming gulfweed or berry carrier, is the chief substance making up this immense shoal. And here's why these water plants collect in this placid Atlantic basin, according to the expert on the subject, Commander Maury, author of The Physical Geography of the Sea. The explanation he gives seems to entail a bit of conditions that everybody knows. Now, Maury said, if bits of cork or chaff or any floating substance be put in a basin, and if a circular motion be given to the water, all the light substances will be found crowding together near the center of the pool, where there is the least motion. Just such a basin is the Atlantic Ocean to the Gulf Stream, and the Sargasso Sea is the center of the whirl. I share Maury's view, and I was able to study the phenomenon in this exclusive setting where ships rarely go. Above us, huddled among the brown weeds, there floated objects originating from all over. Tree trunks ripped from the Rocky Mountains or the Andes and sent floating down the Amazon or Mississippi, numerous pieces of wreckage, remnants of keels or undersides, bulwarks staved in and so weighted down with seashells and barnacles they couldn't rise to the surface of the ocean. And the passing years will someday bear out Maury's other view, that by collecting in this way over the centuries, these substances will be turned to stone by the action of the waters and will then form inexhaustible coal fields, valuable reserves prepared by far-seeing nature for that time when man will have exhausted his mines on the continents. In the midst of these hopelessly tangled fabric of weeds and fucus plants, I noted some delightful pink-colored, star-shaped Alcyon coral, sea anemone trailing the long tresses of their tentacles, some green, red, and blue jellyfish, and especially those big rhizostome jellyfish that Cuvier described, whose bluish parasols are trimmed with violet festoons. We spent the whole day of February 22nd in the Sargasso Sea, where fish that dote on marine plants and crustaceans find plenty to eat. The next day, the ocean resumed its usual appearance. From this moment on, for 19 days from February 23rd to March 12th, the Nautilus stayed in the middle of the Atlantic, hustling us along at a constant speed of 100 leagues every 24 hours. It was obvious that Captain Nemo wanted to carry out his underwater program, and I had no doubt that he intended, after doubling Cape Horn, to return to the Pacific South Seas. So Ned Land had good reason to worry. In these wide seas empty of islands, it was no longer feasible to jump ship, nor did we have any way to counter Captain Nemo's whims. We had no choice but to acquiesce, but if we couldn't attain our end through force or cunning, I like to think we might achieve it through persuasion. Once this voyage was over, might not Captain Nemo consent to set us free in return for our promise never to reveal his existence? Our word of honor, which we sincerely would have kept. However, this delicate question would have to be negotiated with the captain. But how would he receive our demands for freedom? At the very outset, and in no uncertain terms, hadn't he declared that the secret of his life required that we be permanently imprisoned on board the Nautilus? Wouldn't he see my 4 month silence as a tacit acceptance of this situation? Would my returning to this subject arouse suspicions that could jeopardize our escape plans if we had promising circumstances for trying them again later on? I weighed all these considerations, turned them over in my mind, submitted them to Conseil, but he was as baffled as I was. In short, although I'm not easily discouraged, I realized that my chances of ever seeing my fellow men again were shrinking by the day, especially at a time when Captain Nemo was recklessly racing toward the South Atlantic. During these 19 days just mentioned, no unique incidents distinguished our voyage. I saw little of the captain. He was at work. In the library, I often found books he had left open, especially books on natural history. He had thumbed through my work on the great ocean depths, and the margins were covered with his notes, which sometimes contradicted my theories and formulations. But the captain remained content with this method of refining my work, and he rarely discussed it with me. Sometimes I heard melancholy sounds reverberating from the organ, which he played very expressively, but only at night, in the midst of the most secretive darkness, while the Nautilus slumbered in the wilderness of the ocean. During this part of our voyage, we navigated on the surface of the waves for entire days. The sea was nearly deserted. A few sailing ships, laden for the East Indies, were heading toward the Cape of Good Hope. One day we were chased by the longboats of a whaling vessel, which undoubtedly viewed us as some enormous baleen whale of great value. But Captain Nemo didn't want these gallant gentlemen wasting their time and energy, so he ended the hunt by diving beneath the waves. This incident seemed to fascinate Ned Land intensely. I'm sure the Canadian was sorry that these fishermen couldn't harpoon our sheet iron cetacean and mortally wounded. During this period, the fish Conseil and I observed differed little from those we had already studied in other latitudes. Chief among them were specimens of that dreadful cartilaginous genus that's subdivided into three subgenera, numbering at least 32 species. Striped sharks 5 meters long, the head squat and wider than the body, the caudal fin curved, the back with 7 big, black, parallel lines running lengthwise. Then purloined sharks, ash gray, pierced with 7 gill openings, furnished with a single dorsal fin placed almost exactly in the middle of the body. Some big dogfish also passed by, a voracious species of shark, if there ever was one. With some justice, fishermen's yarns aren't to be trusted, but here's what a few of them relate. Inside the corpse of one of these animals, there were found a buffalo head and a whole calf. In another, 2 tuna and a sailor in uniform. In yet another, a soldier with his saber. In another, finally, a horse with its rider. In candor, none of these sounds like divinely inspired truth. But the fact remains that not a single dogfish let itself get caught in the Nautilus's nets, so I can't account for their veracity. Schools of elegant, playful dolphins swam alongside for entire days. They went in groups of 5 or 6, hunting in packs like wolves over the countryside. Moreover, they're just as voracious as dogfish, if I can believe a certain Copenhagen professor who says that from one dolphin's stomach he removed 13 porpoises and 15 seals. True, it was a killer whale, belonging to the biggest known species, whose length sometimes exceeds 24 feet. The family Delphina numbers 10 genera, and the dolphins I saw were akin to the genus Delphinorychens, and remarkable for an extremely narrow muzzle 4 times as long as the cranium. Measuring 3 meters, their bodies were black on top, underneath a pinkish white strewn with small, very scattered spots. From these seas, I'll also mention some unusual specimens of croakers, fish from the order of Acanthrope pterygia, family Cyanidea. Some authors, more artistic than scientific, claim that these fish are melodious singers, that their voices in unison put on concerts unmatched by human choristers. I don't say nay, but to my regret, these croakers didn't serenade us as we passed. Finally, to conclude, Conseil classified a large number of flying fish. Nothing could have made a more unusual sight than the marvelous timing with which dolphins hunt these fish. Whatever the range of its flight, however evasive its trajectory, even up and over the Nautilus, the hapless flying fish always found a dolphin to welcome it with open mouth. These were either flying gurnards or kite-like sea robins, whose lips glowed in the dark, at night scrawling fiery streaks in the air before plunging into the murky waters like so many shooting stars. Our navigating continued under these conditions until March 13th. That day, the Nautilus was put to work in some depth-sounding experiments that fascinated me deeply. By then, we had fared nearly 13,000 leagues from our starting point in the Pacific high seas. Our position fixed placed us in latitude 45 degrees 37 south and longitude 37 degrees 53 west. These were the same waterways where Captain Denham, aboard the Herald, paid out 14,000 meters of sounding line without finding bottom. It was here, too, that Lieutenant Parker, aboard the frigate Congress, was unable to reach the underwater soil at 15,149 meters. Captain Nemo decided to take his Nautilus down to the lowest depths in order to double-check these different soundings. I got ready to record the results of this experiment. The panels in the lounge opened, and maneuvers began for reaching those strata so prodigiously far removed. It was apparently considered out of the question to dive by filling the ballast tanks. Perhaps they wouldn't sufficiently increase the Nautilus's specific gravity. Moreover, in order to come back up, it would be necessary to expel the excess water, and our pumps might not have been strong enough to overcome the outside pressure. Captain Nemo decided to make for the ocean floor by submerging on an approximately gradual diagonal with the help of his side fins, which were set at a 45-degree angle to the Nautilus's waterline. Then the propeller was brought to its maximum speed, and its four blades churned the waves with indescribable violence. Under this powerful thrust, the Nautilus's hull quivered like a resonating cord, and the ship sank steadily under the waters. Stationed in the lounge, the captain and I watched the needle swerving swiftly over the pressure gauge. Soon we had gone below the livable zone where most fish reside. Some of these animals can thrive only at the surface of seas or rivers, but a minority can dwell at fairly great depths. Among the latter, I observed a species of dogfish called the cow shark that's equipped with 6 respiratory slits, the telescopic fish with its enormous eyes, the armored gurnard with thick gray thoracic fins plus black pectoral fins, and a breastplate protected by pale red slabs of bone, then finally the grenadier, living at a depth of 1,200 meters, by that point tolerating a pressure of 120 atmospheres. I asked Captain Nemo if he'd observed any fish at more considerable depths. Fish? Rarely, he answered me. But given the current state of marine science, who are we to presume? What do we really know about these depths? Just this, Captain. In going towards the ocean's lower strata, we know that vegetable life disappears more quickly than animal life. We know that moving creatures can still be encountered where water plants no longer grow. We know that oysters and pilgrim scallops live in 2,000 meters of water, and that Admiral McClintock, England's hero of the polar seas, pulled in a live sea star from a depth of 2,500 meters. We know that the crew of the Royal Navy's Bulldog fished up a starfish from 2,620 fathoms, hence from a depth of more than 1 vertical league. Would you still say, Captain Nemo, that we really know nothing? No, Professor, the captain replied. I wouldn't be so discourteous. Yet I'll ask you to explain how these creatures can live at such depths. I'll explain it on 2 grounds, I replied. In the first place, because vertical currents, which are caused by differences in the water's salinity and density, can produce enough motion to sustain the rudimentary lifestyles of sea lilies and starfish. True, the captain put in. In the second place, because oxygen is the basis of life, and we know that the amount of oxygen dissolved in salt water increases rather than decreases with depth, while the pressure in these lower strata helps to concentrate their oxygen content. Oh, we know that, do we? Captain Nemo replied in a tone of mild surprise. Well, Professor, we have good reason to know it because it's the truth. I might add, in fact, that the air bladders of fish contain more nitrogen than oxygen when these animals are caught at the surface of the water, and conversely more oxygen than nitrogen when they're pulled up from the lower depths, which bears out your formulation. But let's continue our observation. My eyes flew back to the pressure gauge. The instrument indicated a depth of 6,000 meters. Our submergence had been going on for an hour. The Nautilus slid downward on its slanting fin, still sinking. These deserted waters were wonderfully clear, with a transparency impossible to convey. An hour later, we were at 13,000 meters, about 3¼ vertical leagues, and the ocean floor was nowhere in sight. However, at 14,000 meters, I saw blackish peaks rising in the midst of the waters. But these summits could have belonged to mountains as high or even higher than the Himalayas or Mount Blanc, and the extent of these depths remained incalculable. Despite the powerful pressures it was undergoing, the Nautilus sank still deeper. I could feel its cast iron plates trembling down to their riveted joins. Metal bars arched, bulkheads groaned, the lounge windows seemed to be warping inward under the water's pressure. And this whole sturdy mechanism would surely have given way, if, as its captain had said, it weren't capable of resisting like a solid block. While grazing these rocky slopes lost under the waters, I still spotted some seashells, tube worms, lively annelid worms from the genus Spirorbis, and certain starfish specimens. But soon these last representatives of animal life vanished, and 3 vertical leagues down, the Nautilus passed below the limits of underwater existence, just as an air balloon rises above the breathable zones in the sky. We reached a depth of 16,000 meters, 4 vertical leagues, and by then the Nautilus's plating was tolerating a pressure of 1,600 atmospheres. In other words, 1,600 kilograms per each square centimeter on its surface. What an experience, I exclaimed, traveling these steep regions where no man has ever ventured before. Look, Captain, look at these magnificent rocks, these uninhabited caves, these last global haunts where life is no longer possible. What unheard of scenery, and why are we reduced to preserving it only as a memory? Would you like, Captain Nemo asked me, to bring back more than just a memory? What do you mean? I mean that nothing could be easier than taking a photograph of this underwater region. Before I had time to express the surprise this new proposition caused me, a camera was carried into the lounge at Captain Nemo's request. The liquid setting, electrically lit, unfolded with perfect clarity through the wide-open panels. No shadows, no blurs, thanks to our artificial light. Not even sunshine could have been better for our purposes. With the thrust of its propeller curved by the slant of its fins, the Nautilus stood still. The camera was aimed at the scenery on the ocean floor, and in a few seconds we had a perfect negative. I attach a print of the positive. In it you can view these primordial rocks that have never seen the light of day, this nether granite that forms the powerful foundation of our globe, the deep caves cut into the stony mass, the outlines of incomparable distinctness whose far edges stand out in black as if from the brush of certain Flemish painters. In the distance is a mountainous horizon, a wonderfully undulating line that makes up the background of this landscape. The general effect of these smooth rocks is indescribable. Black, polished, without moss or other blemish, carved into strange shapes, sitting firmly on a carpet of sand that sparkled beneath our streams of electric light. Meanwhile, his photographic operations over, Captain Nemo told me, "Let's go back up, Professor. We mustn't push our luck and expose the Nautilus too long to these pressures." "Let's go back up," I replied. "Hold on tight." Before I had time to realize why the captain made this recommendation, I was hurled to the carpet. Its fins set vertically, its propeller thrown in gear at the captain's signal, the Nautilus rose with lightning speed, shooting upward like an air balloon into the sky. Vibrating resonantly, it knifed through the watery mass. Not a single detail was visible. In 4 minutes, it had cleared the 4 vertical leagues separating it from the surface of the ocean, and after emerging like a flying fish, it fell back into the sea, making the waves leap to prodigious heights. Chapter 13. The Ice Bank. The Nautilus resumed its unruffled southbound heading. It went along the 50th meridian with considerable speed. Would it go to the pole? I didn't think so, because every previous attempt to reach this spot on the globe had failed. Besides, the season was already quite advanced, since March 13th on Antarctic shores corresponds with September 13th in the northernmost regions, which marks the beginning of the equinoctial period. On March 14th, at latitude 55 degrees, I spotted floating ice, plain pale bits of rubble 20 to 25 feet long, which formed reefs over which the sea burst into foam. The Nautilus stayed on the surface of the ocean. Having fished in the Arctic seas, Ned Land was already familiar with the sight of icebergs. Conseil and I were marveling at them for the first time. In the sky toward the southern horizon, there stretched a dazzling white band. English whalers have given this name ice blink. No matter how heavy the clouds may be, they can't obscure this phenomenon. It announces the presence of a pack or shoal of ice. Indeed, larger blocks of ice soon appeared, their brilliance varying at the whims of the mists. Some of these masses displayed green veins, as if scrawled with undulating lines of copper sulfate. Others looked like enormous amethysts, letting the light penetrate their insides. The latter reflected the sun's rays from the 1,000 facets of their crystals. The former, tinted with a bright limestone sheen, would have supplied enough building material to make a whole marble town. The farther down south we went, the more these floating islands grew in number and prominence. Polar birds nested on them by the thousands. These were petrels, cape pigeons, or puffins, and their calls were deafening. Mistaking the Nautilus for the corpse of a whale, some of them alighted on it and prodded its resonant steel iron with pecks of their beak. During this navigating in the midst of the ice, Captain Nemo often stayed on the platform. He observed these deserted waterways carefully. I saw his calm eyes sometimes perk up. In these polar seas forbidden to men, did he feel right at home, the lord of these unreachable regions? Perhaps, but he didn't say. He stood still, reviving only when his pilot's instincts took over. Then, steering his Nautilus with consummate dexterity, he skillfully dodged the masses of ice, some of which measured several miles in length, their heights varying from 70 to 80 meters. Often the horizon seemed completely closed off. Abreast with latitude 60 degrees, every passageway had disappeared. Searching with care, Captain Nemo soon found a narrow opening into which he brazenly slipped, well aware, however, that it would close behind him. Guided by his skillful hands, the Nautilus passed by all these different masses of ice, which are classified by size and shape with a precision that enraptured Conseil. Icebergs, or mountains, ice fields, or smooth, limitless tracks, drift ice, or floating flows, packs, or broken tracks, called patches when they're circular, and streams when they form long strips. The temperature was fairly low. Exposed to the outside air, the thermometer marked -2 to -3 degrees centigrade. But we were warmly dressed in furs for which seals and aquatic bears had paid the price. Evenly heated by all its electric equipment, the Nautilus's interior defied the most intense cold. Moreover, to find a bearable temperature, the ship had only to sink just a few meters beneath the waves. 2 months earlier, we would have enjoyed perpetual daylight in this latitude, but night already fell for 3 or 4 hours, and later it would cast 6 months of shadow over these circumpolar regions. On March 15th, we passed beyond the latitude of the South Shetland and South Orkney Islands. The captain told me that many tribes of seals used to inhabit these shores, but of English and American whalers, in a fit of destruction, slaughtered all the adults, including pregnant females, and where life and activity once existed, those fishermen left behind only silence and death. Going along the 55th meridian, the Nautilus cut the Antarctic Circle on March 16th near 8 o'clock in the morning. Ice completely surrounded us and closed off the horizon. Nevertheless, Captain Nemo went from passageway to passageway, always proceeding south. "But where's he going?" I asked. "Straight ahead," Conseil replied. "Ultimately, when he can't go any farther, he'll stop." "I wouldn't bet on it," I replied. And in all honesty, I confess that this venturesome excursion was far from displeasing to me. I can't express the intensity of my amazement at the beauties of these new regions. The ice struck superb poses. Here, its general effect suggested an oriental town with countless minarets and mosques. There, a city in ruins, flung to the ground by convulsions in the earth. These views were varied continuously by the sun's oblique rays, or were completely swallowed up by gray mists in the midst of blizzards. Then explosions, cave-ins, and great iceberg somersaults would occur all around us, altering the scenery like the changing landscape in a diorama. If the Nautilus was submerged during these losses of balance, we heard the resulting noises spread under the waters with frightful intensity, and the collapse of these masses created daunting eddies down to the ocean's lower strata. The Nautilus then rolled and pitched like a ship left to the fury of the elements. Often, no longer seeing any way out, I thought we were imprisoned for good. But Captain Nemo, guided by his instincts, discovered new passageways from the tiniest indications. He was never wrong when he observed slender threads of bluish water streaking through these ice fields. Accordingly, I was sure he had already risked his Nautilus in the mist of these Antarctic seas. During the day of March 16th, these tracts of ice completely barred our path. It wasn't the ice bank as yet, just huge ice fields cemented together by the cold. This obstacle couldn't stop Captain Nemo, and he launched his ship against the ice fields with hideous violence. The Nautilus went into these brittle masses like a wedge, splitting them with dreadful cracklings. It was an old-fashioned battering ram propelled with infinite power. Hurled aloft, ice rubble fell back around us like hail. Through brute force alone, the submersible carved out a channel for itself. Carried away by its momentum, the ship sometimes mounted on top of these tracks of ice and crushed them with its weight, or at other times, when cooped up beneath the ice fields, it split them with simple pitching movements, creating wide punctures. Violent squalls assaulting us during the daytime. Thanks to certain heavy mists, we couldn't see from one end of the platform to the other. The wind shifted abruptly to every point on the compass. The snow was piling up in such packed layers it had to be chipped loose with blows from picks. Even in a temperature of merely -5 degrees centigrade, every part of the Nautilus was covered in ice. The ship's rigging would have been unusable because all its tackle would have been jammed in the grooves of the pulleys. Only a craft without sails, driven by an electric motor that needed no coal, could face such high latitudes. Under these conditions, the barometer generally stayed quite low. It fell as far as 73.5 centimeters. Our compass indications no longer offered any guarantees. The deranged needles would mark contradictory directions as we approached the North Magnetic Pole, which doesn't coincide with the South Pole proper. In fact, according to the astronomer Hanstein, this magnetic pole is located fairly close to latitude 70 degrees and longitude 130 degrees, or, abiding by the observations of Louis Isidore Duperrey, in longitude 135 degrees and latitude 70 degrees 30. Hence, we had to transport compasses to different parts of the ship, take many readings, and strike an average. Often we could chart our course only by guesswork, a less than satisfactory method in the midst of these winding passageways whose landmarks change continuously. At last, on March 18th, after 20 futile assaults, the Nautilus was decisively held in check. No longer was it an ice stream, patch, or field. It was an endless, immovable barrier formed by ice mountains fused to each other. The Ice Bank, the Canadian told me. For Ned Land, as well as for every navigator before us, I knew that this was the great, insurmountable obstacle. When the sun appeared for an instant near noon, Captain Nemo took a reasonably accurate sight that gave our position as longitude 51 degrees 30 and latitude 67 degrees 39 south. This was a position already well along in these Antarctic regions. As for the liquid surface of the sea, there was no longer any semblance of it before our eyes. Before the Nautilus's spur there lay vast, unbroken plains, a tangle of confused chunks with all the helter-skelter unpredictability typical of a river's surface a short while before its ice breakup. But in this case, the proportions were gigantic. Here and there stood sharp peaks, lean spires that rose as high as 200 feet. Further off, a succession of deeply cut cliffs sporting a grayish tinge, huge mirrors that reflected the sparse rays of a sun half drowned in mist. Beyond, a stark silence reigned in this desolate natural setting, a silence barely broken by the flapping wings of petrels or puffins. By this point, everything was frozen, even sound. So the Nautilus had to halt in its venturesome course along these tracts of ice. "Sir," Ned Land told me that day, "if your captain goes any further—" "Yes?" "He'll be a Superman." "How so, Ned?" "Because nobody can clear the Ice Bank. Your captain's a powerful man, but damnation, he isn't more powerful than nature. If she draws a boundary line, there you stop, like it or not." "Correct, Ned Land, but I still want to know what's behind this Ice Bank. Behold, my greatest source of irritation, a wall." "Master is right," Conseil said. "Walls were invented simply to frustrate scientists. All walls should be banned." "Fine," the Canadian put in, "but we already know what's behind this Ice Bank." "What?" I asked. "Ice, ice, and more ice." "You may be sure of that, Ned," I answered, "but I'm not. That's why I want to see for myself." "Well, Professor," the Canadian replied, "you can just drop that idea. You've made it to the Ice Bank, which is already far enough, but you won't get any further, neither your Captain Nemo or his Nautilus. And whether he wants to or not, we'll head north again, in other words, to the land of sensible people." I had to agree that Ned Land was right, and until ships are built to navigate over tracts of ice, they'll have to stop at the Ice Bank. Indeed, despite its efforts, despite the powerful methods it used to split this ice, the Nautilus was reduced to immobility. Ordinarily, when someone can't go any further, he still has the option of returning in his tracks. But here it was just as impossible to turn back as to go forward because every passageway had closed behind us. And if our submersible remained even slightly stationary, it would be frozen in without delay. which is exactly what happened near 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and fresh ice kept forming over the ship's sides with astonishing speeds. I had to admit that Captain Nemo's leadership had been most injudicious. Just then I was on the platform. Observing the situation for some while, the captain said to me, "Well, Professor, what think you?" "I think we're trapped, Captain." "Trapped? What do you mean?" "I mean we can't go forward, backwards, or sideways. I think that's the standard definition of trapped, at least in the civilized world." "So, Professor Aronnax, you think the Nautilus won't be able to float clear?" "Only with the greatest difficulty, Captain, since the season is already too advanced for you to depend on an ice breakup." "Oh, Professor," Captain Nemo replied in an ironic tone, "you never change. You only see impediments and obstacles. I promise you, not only will the Nautilus float clear, it will go farther still." "Farther south?" I asked, gaping at the captain. "Yes, sir, it will go to the pole." To the pole!" I exclaimed, unable to keep back a movement of disbelief. "Yes," the captain replied coolly, "the Antarctic pole, that unknown spot crossed by every meridian on the globe. As you know, I do whatever I like with my Nautilus." Yes, I did know that. I knew this man was daring to the point of being foolhardy, but to overcome all the obstacles around the South Pole, even more unobtainable than the North Pole, which still hadn't been reached by the boldest navigators, wasn't this an absolutely insane undertaking, one that could only occur in the brain of a madman? It then dawned on me to ask Captain Nemo if he had already discovered this pole, which no human being had ever trod underfoot. "No, sir," he answered me, "but we'll discover it together. Where others have failed, I'll succeed. Never before has my Nautilus cruised so far into these southernmost seas, but I repeat, it will go farther still." "I'd like to believe you, Captain," I went on, in a tone of some sarcasm. "Oh, I do believe you. Let's forge ahead. There are no obstacles for us. Let's shatter this ice bank. Let's blow it up, and if it still resists, let's put wings on the Nautilus and let's fly over it." "Over it, Captain. Over it, Professor," Captain Nemo replied serenely. "No, not over it, but under it." "Under it!" I exclaimed. A sudden insight into Captain Nemo's plans had just flashed through my mind. I understood. The marvelous talents of his Nautilus will be put to work once again in this superhuman undertaking. "I can see we're starting to understand each other, Professor," Captain Nemo told me with a half-smile. "You already glimpsed the potential, myself I'd say the success, of this attempt. Maneuvers that aren't feasible for an ordinary ship are easy for the Nautilus. If a continent emerges at the pole, we'll stop at that continent. But on the other hand, if open sea washes the pole, we'll go to that very place." "Right," I said, carried away by the captain's logic. "Even though the surface of the sea is solidified into ice, its lower strata are still open, thanks to that divine justice that puts the maximum density of salt water 1 degree above its freezing point. And if I'm not mistaken, the submerged part of this ice bank is in a 4-to-1 ratio to its emerging part." "Very nearly, Professor. For each foot of iceberg above the sea, there are 3 more below. Now then, since these ice mountains don't exceed a height of 100 meters, they sink only to a depth of 300 meters. And what are 300 meters to the Nautilus? A mere nothing, sir. We could all go to greater depths and find that the temperature layer common to all ocean water. And there we'd brave with impunity the -30 or -40 degree cold on the surface." "True, sir, very true," I replied with growing excitement. "Our sole difficulty," Captain Nemo went on, "lies in our staying submerged for several days without renewing our air supply." "That's all?" I answered. "The Nautilus has huge air tanks. We'll fill them up and they'll supply all the oxygen we need." "Good thinking, Professor Aronnax," the captain replied with a smile. "But since I don't want to be accused of foolhardiness, I'm giving you all my objections in advance." You have more?" "Just one. If a sea exists at the South Pole, it's possible this sea may be completely frozen over, so we couldn't come up to the surface." "My dear sir, have you forgotten that the Nautilus is armed with a fearsome spur? Couldn't it be launched diagonally against those tracts of ice which would break open from the impact?" "Ah, Professor, you're full of ideas today. Besides, Captain," I added with still greater enthusiasm, "why wouldn't we find open sea at the South Pole just as at the North Pole? The cold temperature poles and the geographic poles don't coincide in either the northern or southern hemispheres, and until proved to the contrary, we can either assume these 2 spots on the Earth feature either a continent or an ice-free ocean." I think as you do, Professor Aronnax, Captain Nemo replied. I'll only point out that after raising so many arguments against my plan, you're now crushing me under arguments in his favor. Captain Nemo was right. I was outdoing him in daring. It was I who was sweeping him to the pole. I was leading the way. I was out in front. But no, you silly fool. Captain Nemo already knew the pros and cons of this question, and it amused him to see you flying off into impossible fantasies. Nevertheless, he didn't waste an instant. At his signal, the chief officer appeared. The two men held a quick exchange in their incomprehensible language, and either the chief officer had been alerted previously or he found the plan feasible because he showed no surprise. But as unemotional as he was, he couldn't have been more impeccably emotionless than Conseil when I told the fine lad our intention of pushing on to the South Pole. He greeted my announcement with the usual, "As master wishes," and I had to be content with that. As for Ned Land, no human shoulders ever executed a higher shrug than the pair belonging to our Canadian. "Honestly, sir," he told me, "you and your Captain Nemo, I pity you both. But we will go to the pole, Mr. Land." "Maybe, but you won't come back." And Ned Land re-entered his cabin to keep from doing something desperate, he said as he left me. Meanwhile, preparations for this daring attempt were getting underway. The Nautilus's powerful pumps forced air down into the tanks and stored it under high pressure. Near 4 o'clock, Captain Nemo informed me that the platform hatches were about to be closed. I took a last look at the dense ice bank we were going to conquer. The weather was fair, the skies reasonably clear, the cold quite brisk, namely minus 12 degrees centigrade, but after the wind had lulled, this temperature didn't seem too unbearable. Equipped with picks, some 10 men climbed onto the Nautilus's sides and cracked loose the ice around the ship's lower plating, which was soon set free. This operation was swiftly executed because the fresh ice was still thin. We all re-entered the interior. The main ballast tanks were filled with the water that hadn't yet congealed at our line of flotation. The Nautilus submerged without delay. I took a seat in the lounge with Conseil. Through the open window we stared at the lower strata of the southernmost ocean. The thermometer rose again. The needle on the pressure gauge swerved over its dial. About 300 meters down, just as Captain Nemo had predicted, we cruised beneath the undulating surface of the ice bank. But the Nautilus sank deeper still. It reached a depth of 800 meters. At the surface, this water gave a temperature of minus 12 degrees centigrade, but now it gave no more than minus 10. 2 degrees had already been gained. Thanks to its heating equipment, the Nautilus's temperature, needless to say, stayed at a much higher degree. Every maneuver was accomplished with extraordinary precision. "With all due respect to master," Conseil told me, "we'll pass it by." "I fully expect to," I replied in a tone of deep conviction. Now in open water, the Nautilus took a direct course to the pole without veering from the 52nd meridian. From 67 degrees 30 to 90 degrees, 22.5 degrees of latitude were left across. In other words, slightly more than 500 leagues. The Nautilus adopted an average speed of 26 miles per hour, the speed of an express train. If it kept up this pace, 40 hours would do it for reaching the pole. For part of the night, the novelty of our circumstances kept Conseil and me at the lounge window. The sea was lit by our beacon's electric rays, but the depths were deserted. Fish didn't linger in these imprisoned waters. Here they found merely a passageway for going from the Antarctic Ocean to open sea at the pole. Our progress was swift. You could feel it in the vibrations of the long steel hull. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, I went to snatch a few hours of sleep. Conseil did likewise. I didn't encounter Captain Nemo while going down the gangways. I assumed that he was keeping to the pilot house. The next day, March 19th, at 5 o'clock in the morning, I was back at my post in the lounge. The electric log indicated the Nautilus had reduced speed. By then it was rising to the surface, but cautiously while slowly emptying its ballast tanks. My heart was pounding. Would we emerge into the open and find the polar air again? No. A jolt told me that the Nautilus had bumped the underbelly of the ice bank, still quite thick to judge from the hollowness of the accompanying noise. Indeed, we had struck bottom, to use nautical terminology, but in the opposite direction and at a depth of 3,000 feet. They gave us 4,000 feet of ice overhead, of which 1,000 feet emerged above water. So the ice bank was higher here than we had found it on the outskirts, a circumstance less than encouraging. Several times that day, the Nautilus repeated the same experiment, and always it bumped against this surface that formed a ceiling above it. At certain moments, the ship encountered ice at a depth of 900 meters, denoting a thickness of 1,200 meters, of which 300 meters rose above the level of the ocean. This height had tripled since the moment the Nautilus had dived beneath the waves. I meticulously noted these different depths, obtaining the underwater profile of this upside-down mountain chain that stretched beneath the sea. By evening, there was still no improvement in our situation. The ice stayed between 400 and 500 meters deep. It was obviously shrinking, but what a barrier still lay between us and the surface of the ocean. By then it was 8 o'clock. The air inside the Nautilus should have been renewed 4 hours earlier, following daily practice on board. But I didn't suffer very much, although Captain Nemo hadn't yet made demands on the supplementary oxygen in his air tanks. That night my sleep was fitful. Hope and fear besieged me by turns. I got up several times. The Nautilus continued groping. Near 3 o'clock in the morning, I observed that we encountered the Ice Bank's underbelly at a depth of only 50 meters, so only 150 feet separated us from the surface of the water. Little by little, the Ice Bank was turning into an ice field again. The mountains were changing back into plains. My eyes didn't leave the pressure gauge. We kept rising on a diagonal, going along the shiny surface that sparkled beneath our electric rays. Above and below, the Ice Bank was subsiding in long gradients. Mile after mile, it was growing thinner. Finally, at 6 o'clock in the morning on that memorable day of March 19th, the lounge door opened. Captain Nemo appeared. "Open sea," he told me. And we come to our last chapter for this evening, Chapter 14, The South Pole. I rushed up onto the platform. Yes, open sea. Barely a few sparse floes, some moving icebergs, a sea stretching into the distance, hosts of birds in the air, and myriads of fish under the waters, which varied from intense blue to olive green, depending on the depth. The thermometer marked 3 degrees centigrade. It was as if a comparable springtime had been locked up behind that ice bank, whose distant masses were outlined at the northern horizon. "Are we at the pole?" I asked the captain, my heart pounding. "I've no idea," he answered me. "At noon we'll fix our position." "But will the sun show through all this mist?" I said, staring at the grayish sky. "No matter how faintly it shines, it will be enough for me," the captain replied. To the south, 10 miles from the Nautilus, a solitary islet rose to a height of 200 meters. We proceeded toward it, but cautiously, because the sea could have been strewn with reefs. In an hour, we had reached the islet. 2 hours later, we had completed a full circle around it. It measured 4 to 5 miles in circumference. A narrow channel separated it from a considerable shore, perhaps a continent whose limits we couldn't see. The existence of this shore seemed to bear out Commander Maury's hypothesis. In essence, this ingenious American has noted that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel, the sea is covered with floating ice of dimensions much greater than any found in the North Atlantic. From this fact, he drew the conclusion that the Antarctic Circle must contain considerable shores, since icebergs can't form on the high seas but only along coastlines. According to his calculations, this frozen mass enclosing the southernmost pole forms a vast ice cap whose width must reach 4,000 kilometers. Meanwhile, to avoid running aground, the Nautilus halted 3 cable lengths from a strand crowned by superb piles of rock. The skiff was launched to sea. 2 crewmen carrying instruments, the captain, Conseil, and I were on board. It was 10 o'clock in the morning. I hadn't seen Ned Land. No doubt, in the presence of the South Pole, the Canadian hated having to eat his words. A few strokes of the oar brought the skiff to the sand, where it ran aground. Just as Conseil was about to jump ashore, I held him back. "Sir," I told Captain Nemo, "to you belongs the honor of first setting foot upon the shore." "Yes, sir," the captain replied, "and if I have no hesitation in treading this polar soil, it's because no human being until now has left a footprint here." So saying, he leaped lightly onto the sand. His heart must have been throbbing with intense excitement. He scaled an overhanging rock that ended in a small promontory, and there, mute and motionless, with crossed arms and blazing eyes, he seemed to be laying claim to these southernmost regions. After spending 5 minutes in this trance, he turned to us. "Whenever you're ready, sir," he called to me. I got out, Conseil at my heels, leaving the 2 men in the skiff. Over an extensive area, the soil consisted of that igneous gravel called tuff, reddish in color as if made from crushed bricks. The ground was covered with slag, lava flows, and pumice stones. Its volcanic origin was unmistakable. In certain localities, thin smoke holes gave off a sulphurous odor, showing that the inner fires still kept their wide-ranging power. Nevertheless, when I scaled a high escarpment, I could see no volcanoes within a radius of several miles. And in these Antarctic districts, as is well known, Sir James Clark Ross had found the craters of Mount Erebus and Mount Terror in fully active condition on the 167th meridian at latitude 77 degrees 32. The vegetation on this desolate continent struck me as quite limited. A few lichens of the species Usnea melanoxanthra sprawled over the black rocks. The whole meager flora of this region consisted of certain microscopic buds, rudimentary diatoms made up a type of cell positioned between two quartz-rich shells, plus long purple and crimson fucus plants, buoyed by small air bladders and washed up on the coast by the surf. The beach was strewn with mollusks, small mussels, limpets, smooth, heart-shaped cockles, and especially some sea butterflies with oblong, membrane-filled bodies whose heads are formed from two rounded lobes. I also saw myriads of those northernmost sea butterflies 3 centimeters long, which a baleen whale can swallow by the thousands in one gulp. The open waters of the shoreline were alive with these delightful pteropods, true butterflies of the sea. Among other zoophytes present in these shallows, there were a few coral tree forms that, according to Sir James Clark Ross, live in these Antarctic seas at depths as great as 1,000 meters, then small Alcyon coral belonging to the species Procellaria pelagica, also a large number of starfish unique to these climes, plus some feather stars spangling the sand. But it was in the air that life was superabundant. There various species of birds flew and fluttered by the thousands, deafening us with their calls. Crowding the rocks, other fowl watched without fear as we passed and pressed familiarly against our feet. These were auks, as agile and supple in water, but they are sometimes mistaken for fast bonito, as they are clumsy and heavy on land. They uttered outlandish calls and participated in numerous public assemblies that featured as much noise but little action. Among other fowl, I noted some sheathbills from the wading bird family, the size of pigeons, white in color, the beak short and conical, the eyes framed by red circles. Conseil laid in a supply of them, because when they're properly cooked, these winged creatures make a pleasant dish. In the air there passed sooty albatross with 4-meter wingspans, birds aptly dubbed vultures of the ocean, also gigantic petrels, including several with arching wings, enthusiastic eaters of seal that are known as que brantahuesos, and cape pigeons, a sort of small duck, the tops of their bodies black and white. In short, a whole series of petrels, some whitish with wings trimmed in brown, others blue and exclusive to these Antarctic seas, the former so oily, I told Conseil, that inhabitants of the Faroe Islands simply fit the bird with a wick and then light it up. With that minor addition, Conseil replied, these fowl would make perfect lamps. After this, we should insist that nature equip them with wicks and advance. Half a mile further on, the ground was completely riddled with penguin nests, egg-laying burrows from which numerous birds emerged. Later, Captain Nemo had hundreds of them hunted because their black flesh is highly edible. They brayed like donkeys, the size of a goose with slate-colored bodies, unwhite undersides, and lemon-colored neckbands. These animals let themselves be stoned to death without making any effort to get away. Meanwhile, the mist didn't clear, and by 11 o'clock the sun still hadn't made an appearance. Its absence disturbed me. Without it, no sights were possible. Then how could we tell whether we had reached the pole? Then when I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him leaning silently against a piece of rock and staring at the sea. He seemed impatient, baffled. But what could we do? This daring and powerful man couldn't control the sun as he did the sea. Noon arrived without the orb of day appearing for a single instant. You couldn't even find its hiding place behind the curtain of mist. And soon this mist began to condense into snow. Until tomorrow, the captain said simply, and we went back to the Nautilus amid flurries in the air. During our absence, the nets had been spread, and I observed with fascination the fish just hauled on board. The Antarctic seas serve as a refuge for an extremely large number of migratory fish that flee from storms in the subpolar zones, in truth only to slide down the gullets of porpoises and seals. I noted some 1 decimeter south bullhead, a species of white cartilaginous fish overrun with bluish-gray stripes and armed with stings, then some Antarctic rabbitfish 3 feet long, the body very slender, the skin a smooth silver white, the head rounded, the topside furnished with 3 fins, the snout ending in a trunk that curved back toward the mouth. I sampled its flesh, but found it tasteless, despite Conseil's views, which were largely approving. The blizzard lasted until the next day. It was impossible to stay on the platform. From the lounge where I was writing up the incidents of this excursion to the polar continent, I could hear the calls of petrel and albatross cavorting in the midst of the turmoil. The Nautilus didn't stay idle, and cruising along the coast, it advanced some 10 miles farther south amid the half-light left by the sun as it skimmed the edge of the horizon. The next day, March 20th, it stopped snowing. The cold was a little more brisk. The thermometer marked -2 degrees centigrade. The mist had cleared, and on that day I hoped our noon sights could be accomplished. Since Captain Nemo hadn't yet appeared, only Conseil and I were taken ashore by the skiff. The soil's nature was still the same, volcanic. Traces of lava, slag, and basaltic rock were everywhere, but I couldn't find the crater that had vomited them up. There as yonder, myriads of birds enlivened this part of the polar continent, but they had to share the dominion with huge herds of marine mammals that looked at us with gentle eyes. These were seals of various species, some stretched out on the ground, others lying on drifting ice floes, several leaving or re-entering the sea. Having never dealt with man, they didn't run off at our approach, and I counted enough of them thereabouts to provision a couple hundred ships. "Ye gods," Conseil said, "it is fortunate that Ned Land didn't come with us." "Why so, Conseil?" "Because that madcap hunter would kill every animal here." "Every animal may be overstating it, but in truth I doubt we could keep our Canadian friend from harpooning some of these magnificent cetaceans, which would be an affront to Captain Nemo, since he hates to slay harmless beasts needlessly." "He's right." "Certainly, Conseil, but tell me, haven't you finished classifying these superb specimens of marine fauna?" "Master is well aware," Conseil replied, "that I'm not seasoned in practical application. When Master has told me these animals' names, they're seals and walruses. Two genera, our scholarly Conseil hastened to say, that belong to the family Pinnipedia, order Carnivora, group Unguiculata, subclass Monodelphia, class Mammalia, branch Vibrata." "Very nice, Conseil," I replied, "but these two genera of seals and walruses are each divided into species, and if I'm not mistaken, we now have a chance to actually look at them. Let's." It was 8 o'clock in the morning. We had 4 hours to ourselves before the sun could be productively observed. I guided our steps toward a huge bay that made a crescent-shaped incision in the granite cliffs along the beach. There, all about us, I swear that the shores and ice floes were crowded with marine mammals as far as the eye could see, and I involuntarily looked around for old Proteus, the mythological shepherd who guards King Neptune's immense flocks. To be specific, these were seals. They formed distinct male and female groups, the father watching over his family, the mother suckling her little ones, the stronger youngsters emancipated a few paces away. When these mammals wanted to relocate, they moved in little jumps made by contracting their bodies, clumsily helped by their imperfectly developed flippers, which, as with their manatee relatives, form actual forearms. In the water, their ideal element, I must say these animals swim wonderfully thanks to their flexible backbones, narrow pelvises, close-cropped hair, and webbed feet. Resting on shore, they assumed extremely graceful positions. Consequently, their gentle features, their sensitive expressions equal to those of the loveliest women, their soft, limpid eyes, their charming poses, led the ancients to glorify them by metamorphosizing the males into sea gods and the females into mermaids. I drew Conseil's attention to the considerable growth of the cerebral lobes found in these intelligent cetaceans. No mammal except man has more abundant cerebral matter. Accordingly, seals are quite capable of being educated. They make good pets, and together with certain other naturalists, I think these animals can be properly trained to perform yeoman service as hunting dogs for fishermen. Most of these seals were sleeping on the rocks or the sand. Among these properly termed seals, which have no external ears, unlike sea lions, whose ears protrude, I observed several varieties of the species Stenorhynchus, 3 meters long, with white hair, bulldog heads, and armed with 10 teeth in each jaw, 4 incisors in both the upper and lower, plus 2 big canines shaped like the fleur-de-lis. Among them slithered some sea elephants, a type of seal with a short, flexible trunk. These are the giants of the species, with a circumference of 20 feet and a length of 10 meters. They didn't move as we approached. "Are these animals dangerous?" Conseil asked me. "Only if they're attacked," I replied, "but when these giant seals defend their little ones, their fury is dreadful, and it is rare for them to smash a fisherman's longboat to bits." "They're within your rights," Conseil answered. "I don't say nay." 2 miles farther on, we were stopped by a promontory that screened the bay from southerly winds. It dropped straight down to the sea, and surf foamed against it. From beyond this ridge there came fearsome bellows, such as a herd of cattle might produce. Gracious, Conseil put in. A choir of bulls? No, I said a choir of walruses. Are they fighting with each other? Either fighting or playing. With all due respect to master, this we must see. Then see it we must, Conseil. And there we were, climbing these blackish rocks amid sudden landslides and over stones slippery with ice. More than once I took a tumble at the expense of my backside. Conseil, more cautious or more stable, barely faltered and would help me up, saying if master's legs would kindly adopt a wider stance, master would keep his balance. Arriving at the topmost ridge of this promontory, I could see vast white plains covered with walruses. These animals were playing among themselves. They were howling not in anger, but in glee. Walruses resemble seals in the shape of their bodies and the arrangement of their limbs, but their lower jaws lack canines and incisors, and as for their upper canines, they consist of two tusks 80 centimeters long, with a circumference of 33 centimeters at the socket. Made of solid ivory without striations, harder than elephant tusks, and less prone to yellowing, these teeth are in great demand. Accordingly, walruses are the victims of a mindless hunting that will soon destroy them all, since their hunters indiscriminately slaughter pregnant females and youngsters, and over 4,000 individuals are destroyed annually. Passing near these unusual animals, I could examine them at my leisure, since they didn't stir. Their hides were rough and heavy, a tan color leaning toward a reddish brown. Their coats were short and less than abundant. Some were 4 meters long. More tranquil and less fearful than their northern relatives, they posted no sentinels on guard duty at the approaches to their campsite. After examining this community of walruses, I decided to return in my tracks. It was 11 o'clock, and if Captain Nemo found conditions favorable for taking his sights, I wanted to be present at the operation. But I held no hopes that the sun would make an appearance that day. It was hidden from our eyes by clouds squeezed together on the horizon. Apparently, the jealous orb didn't want to reveal this inaccessible spot on the globe to any human being. Yet I decided to return to the Nautilus. We went along a steep, narrow path that ran over the cliff's summit. By 11:30, we had arrived at our landing place. The beach skiff had brought the captain ashore. I spotted him standing on a chunk of basalt. His instruments were beside him. His eyes were focused on the northern horizon, along which the sun was sweeping in its extended arc. I found a place near him and waited without speaking. Noon arrived, and just as on the day before, the sun didn't put in an appearance. It was sheer bad luck. Our noon sights were still lacking. If we couldn't obtain them tomorrow, we would finally have to give up any hope of fixing our position. In essence, it was precisely March 20th. Tomorrow, the 21st, was the day of the equinox. The sun would disappear below the horizon for 6 months, not counting refraction, and after its disappearance, the long polar night would begin. Following the September equinox, the sun had emerged above the northerly horizon, rising in long spirals until December 21st. At that time, the summer solstice of these southernmost regions, the sun had started back down, and tomorrow it would cast its last rays. I shared my thoughts and fears with Captain Nemo. "You're right, Professor Aronnax," he told me. "If I can't take the sun's altitude tomorrow, I will be able to try again for another 6 months. But precisely because sailor's luck has led me into these seas on March 21st, it will be easy to get our bearings as the noonday sun does appear before our eyes." "Why easy, Captain?" "Because when the orb of day sweeps in such long spirals, it's difficult to measure its exact altitude above the horizon, and our instruments are open to committing serious errors." "Then what can you do?" "I use only my chronometer," Captain Nemo answered me. "At noon tomorrow, March 21st, if, after accounting for refraction, the sun's disk is cut exactly in half by the northern horizon, that will mean I'm at the South Pole." "Right," I said. "Nevertheless, it isn't mathematically exact proof, because the equinox needn't fall precisely at noon." "No doubt, sir, but the error will be under 100 meters, and that's close enough for us." "Till tomorrow, then." Captain Nemo went back on board. Conseil and I stayed behind until 5 o'clock, surveying the beach, observing and studying. The only unusual object I picked up was an auk's eggs of remarkable size, for which a collector would have paid more than 1,000 francs. Its cream-colored tint, plus the streaks and markings that decorated it like so many hieroglyphics, made it a rare trinket. I placed it in Conseil's hands, and, holding it like precious precious porcelain from China, that cautious, sure-footed lad got it back to the Nautilus in one piece. There I put this rare egg inside one of the glass cases in the museum. I ate supper, feasting with appetite on an excellent piece of seal liver whose flavor reminded me of pork. Then I went to bed, but not without praying, like a good Hindu, for the favors of the radiant orb. The next day, March 21st, bright and early at 5 o'clock in the morning, I climbed onto the platform. I found Captain Nemo there. "The weather's clearing a bit," he told me. "I have high hopes. After breakfast, we'll make our way ashore and choose an observation spot." This issue settled, I went to find Ned Land. I wanted to take him with me. The obstinate Canadian refused, and I could clearly see that his tight-lipped mood and his bad temper were growing by the day. Under the circumstances, I ultimately wasn't sorry that he refused. In truth, there were too many seals ashore, and it would never do to expose this impulsive fisherman to such temptations. Breakfast over, I made my way ashore. The Nautilus had gone a few more miles during the night. It lay well out, a good league from the coast, which was crowned by a sharp peak 400 to 500 meters high. In addition to me, the skiff carried Captain Nemo, 2 crewmen, and the instruments, in other words, a chronometer, a spyglass, and a barometer. During our crossing, I saw numerous baleen whales belonging to the 3 species unique to these southernmost seas: the bowhead whale, or right whale according to the English, which has no dorsal fin, the humpback whale from the genus Balænoptera, in other words, winged whales, beasts with wrinkled bellies and huge whitish fins that, genus name regardless, do not yet form wings, and the finback whale, yellowish-brown, the swiftest of all cetaceans. This powerful animal is audible from far away when it sends up towering spouts of air and steam that resemble swirls of smoke. Herds of these different mammals were playing about in the tranquil waters, and I could easily see that this Antarctic polar basin now served as a refuge for those cetaceans too relentlessly pursued by hunters. I also noted long, whitish strings of salps, a type of mollusk found in clusters, and some jellyfish of large size that swayed in the eddies of the billows. By 9 o'clock we had pulled up to shore. The sky was growing brighter. Clouds were fleeing from the south. Mists were rising from the cold surface of the water. Captain Nemo headed towards the peak, which he no doubt planned to make his observatory. It was an arduous climb over sharp lava and pumice stones in the midst of air often reeking with sulphurous flames from the smoke holes. For a man out of practice at treading land, the captain scaled the steepest slopes with an supple agility I couldn't equal, and which would have been envied by hunters of Pyrenees mountain goats. It took us 2 hours to reach the summit of this half-crystal, half-basalt peak. From there our eyes scanned a vast sea, which scrawled its boundary line firmly against the background of the northern sky. At our feet, dazzling tracts of white. Over our heads, a pale azure, clear of mists. North of us, the sun's disk, like a ball of fire already cut into by the edge of the horizon. From the heart of the waters, jets of liquid rising like hundreds of magnificent bouquets. Far off, like a sleeping cetacean, the Nautilus. Behind us and to the south and east, an immense shore, a chaotic heap of rocks and ice whose limits we couldn't see. Arriving at the summit of this peak, Captain Nemo carefully determined its elevation by means of his barometer, since he had to take this factor into account in his noon sights. At 11:45, the sun, by then seen only by refraction, looked like a golden disk, dispersing its last rays over this deserted continent and down to these seas not yet plowed by the ships of man. Captain Nemo had brought a spyglass with a reticular eyepiece, which corrected the sun's refraction by means of a mirror, and he used it to observe the orb sinking little by little along a very extended diagonal that reached just below the horizon. I held the chronometer. My heart was pounding mightily. If the lower half of the sun's disk disappeared just as the chronometer said noon, we were right at the pole. "Noon!" I called. "The South Pole," Captain Nemo replied in a solemn voice, handing me the spyglass, which showed the orb of day cut into 2 exactly equal parts by the horizon. I stared at the last rays wreathing this peak, while shadows were gradually climbing its gradients. Just then, resting his hand on my shoulder, Captain Nemo said to me, "In 1600, sir, the Dutchman Gerrit was swept by storms and currents, reaching latitude 64 degrees south and discovering the South Shetland Islands. On January 17, 1773, the famous Captain Cook went along the 38th meridian, arriving at latitude 67 degrees 30, and on January 30th, 1774, along the 109th meridian, he reached latitude 71 degrees 15. In 1819, the Russian Bellinghausen lay on the 69th parallel, and in 1821 on the 66th at longitude 111 west. In 1820, the Englishman Bransfield stopped at 65 degrees. That same year, the American Morrill, whose reports are dubious, went along the 42nd meridian, finding open sea at latitude 70 degrees 14. In 1825, the Englishman Powell was unable to get beyond 62 degrees. That same year, a humble seal fisherman, the Englishman Weddell, went as far as latitude 72 degrees 14 on the 6th and the 35th meridian, and as far as 74 degrees 15 on the 36th. In 1829, the Englishman Forster, commander of the Chanticleer, laid claim to the Antarctic continent in latitude 63 degrees 26 and longitude 66 degrees 26. On February 1st, 1831, the Englishman Biscoe discovered Enderby Land at latitude 38 degrees 50. Adelaide Land at latitude 67 degrees on February 5th, 1832, and Graham Land at latitude 64 degrees 45 on February 21st. In 1838, the Frenchman Dumont d'Urville stopped at the Ice Bank in latitude 62 degrees 57, sighting the Louis-Philippe Peninsula. On January 21st, 2 years later, at a new southerly position of 66 degrees 30, he named the Adelaide coast, and 8 days later, the Clary coast at 64 degrees 40. In 1838, the American Wilkes advanced as far as the 69th parallel on the 100th meridian. In 1839, the Englishman Balleny discovered the Sabrina coast at the edge of the polar circle. Lastly, on January 12, 1842, with his ships, the Erebus and the Terror, the Englishman Sir James Clark Ross found Victoria Land in latitude 70 degrees 56 and longitude 171 degrees 7 east. On the 23rd of that same month, he reached the 77th parallel, a position denoting the farthest south attained until then. On the 27th, he lay at 76 degrees 8. On the 28th, at 77 degrees 32. On February 2nd, at 78 degrees 4, and late in 1842, he returned to 71 but couldn't get beyond it. Well now, in 1868, on this 21st day of March, I, myself, Captain Nemo, have reached the South Pole at 90 degrees, and I hereby claim this entire part of the globe, equal to 1/6 of the known continents. In the name of which sovereign, Captain? In my own name, sir. So saying, Captain Nemo unfurled a black flag bearing a gold N on its quartered bunting. Then, turning toward the orb of day, whose last rays were licking at the sea's horizon, "Farewell, O sun," he called. "Disappear, O radiant orb. Retire beneath this open sea, and let 6 months of night spread their shadows over my new domains." And that is where I shall leave you, and when we come back the next time, we will finish our reading of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. So I hope you enjoyed it tonight. Keep reading, keep wearing your fabulous hats. Go on our YouTube page for the Washington County Free Library. Check out all of our past chapters episodes. Check out our OG animated episodes. Check out all of our fun videos for all of our other programming. And I will see you next time for the conclusion of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Good night.